Hello and welcome to the third video in the Introduction to Unity series. In this video we're going to have a look at manipulating objects in 3D and navigating your scene in 3D. Now these are things, I've been doing this for many years now and it comes second nature to me. That's just because I've been well practiced. This is something that probably will take you a little while just to get used to, and something to get you a little while to get your head around, but it is one of those things that will become second nature with a little bit of practice. Now, first of all, to manipulate objects in 3D in our scene, we need to create something in our scene to manipulate. So what I'm going to get you to do is, let's create a plane. Let's create a ground plane first. So in our hierarchy window, we can right click, go to 3D object and then click on plane, or we can click at game object at the top here, go to 3D object and click on plane. This will give us a nice white plane in our scene. Now what I'm going to do is just quickly show you how to navigate around your scene first of all, and then we're going to place a few objects within this scene. Okay, so the main controls that you need to know are dolly, which is holding Alt, left clicking and dragging. So that allows you to dolly around a single point. Next thing we want to know how to do is what's called panning. So that's done by holding Alt, middle click on your mouse and drag around. So that pans your object on your camera on a 2D plane relative the object, perpendicular to the object. And then we have zoom, which is your scroll button, or Alt, right click and drag is also another way of zooming. These may be slightly different on Mac, but I'll post those in the I'll post those differences in the Google document. Okay, so what you probably want to do now is just get used to that movement. So dollying, panning, zooming out to frame things up. There is another way of navigating around your scene too. So if you hold down the right click, you'll notice that this eye icon with the little Tetris block pops up around it. If you use the W, A, S and D keys, if anyone's familiar with first person shooters or most computer games, those keys are used for movement. This allows you to navigate around your scene in somewhat of a first person kind of view. Another handy one is, say if I've gone all the way over here and I don't know where I am in my scene and I can't find an object, if I click on that object in the hierarchy view over here, hover over the scene and press F, it will frame that up. By frame it up, it means it will put it into the center of the screen and zoom in on it at a certain level, zoom in on it so it takes up most of the frame. You will notice just then when I did press F that the plane doesn't seem visible from underneath. That's because meshes will only render from one side traditionally with most materials. So just make sure that you hold down your Alt, left click and dolly around just to make sure that you can see that. Alright, so that's basic navigation. Let's go about translating our objects, or let's position our objects. So to do that, we've got a bunch of controls up the top here. So you notice I click on my plane, either in my hierarchy or I can click it in my scene. And if I click on these different controls here in the top left, so there's the four-way arrow, you notice I get this arrow gizmo. If I click on these two arrows cycling around, I get this circular gizmo. If I click on this one here, I get this gizmo with boxes. Now these are our translate, so it translates your position, rotation, so that rotates your object, and scale, which scales your object. Now what we can do, we can access these as well by pressing W for move, E for rotation, and R for scale. They're W, E, and R. Now they're all grouped together in the top left-hand side of your keyboard. Now if we press E, this brings up our movement gizmo. So the movement gizmo has 3 arrows. If I click and drag on this blue arrow, it confines the movement to the Z axis, which is front and back. If I click on the red arrow, which is the left axis, that is left to right. And if I click on this arrow here, this is our Y axis, which is up and down. Okay, now you'll notice here in the inspector that it's actually changing our position values here. So if I click and drag on the X axis, you'll notice that our X value is changing. Now what I want to do here is make sure that we're going to place our plane at what's called world 0. So I'm going to set this value here. I can type the value in as well as 0. Click on Y, set that to 0. Click on Z and set that to 0 as well. Now we know that this object is right in the middle of our world. And that's always a good place to start when you're creating a 3D scene. Okay, now just to show you through the other gizmos, I'll click on our rotation one here. Now you'll see here we've got the rotation gizmo, and similarly to the movement gizmo or the transform gizmo, if I click and drag on any of these circles specifically, now you've got to be pretty careful on this one because otherwise you'll end up dragging it on all axes. You'll notice that it confines it to a particular axis when it's manipulating it. There we go. If I click in between them, it will rotate around all those axes simultaneously. Now, if I've done something that I don't like, as with most programs, you can hold Control and press Z and it will undo. Or you can go to Edit, Undo. So if I move that, I don't like that, oops, it's the wrong way around, I'll go Edit, Undo, Rotate. Okay, last thing to look at for 3D manipulation is scale. So we've got our scale here. Similarly to our transformation, our translation tool, we can hold on one axis and constrain it to a single axis. This won't scale in the y-axis because a plane is infinitely thin, so you cannot scale something that is infinitely thin. The only difference with this one here is if I click and hold this middle one here, it will what's called uniformly scale the object, so it will scale it equally in all axes. One thing I did just forget to mention quickly is if I go back to this translation gizmo, you'll notice that in between these axes there are these little planes here. Now remember, if I click and drag on this axis, it will move it up and down. If I click and drag on this one, it will move it back and forth. But if I click on one of these little planes, it will allow me to move it on that perpendicular plane there. If I click and drag this one, it will allow me to move it on that plane. Again, pressing Ctrl Z if I do something that I don't want to do. Okay, so that's basics of navigation of your scene and 3D manipulation of objects. So just have a bit of a play with that. Maybe try creating a sphere or a cube as well to put in your scene. So go to Game Object, 3D Object, let's go Cube, and just play around with positioning these in your scene as well. Let's go Game Object, 3D Object, and let's add a sphere. There we go. Oh, there you go. So imagine that's down there. I can't see it. Let's just press F. Dolly around. Okay, there you go. It's hiding underneath there. Let's just move that up. And just have a bit of a play with moving these around your scene and getting used to the navigation and object manipulation. Great. I'll see you in the next tutorial.